Hello, friends. Welcome. My name is Tom, pronouns they, them.
I'm Kimberly, they, them.
I'm Kit, she, her, they, them.
Hi, Kit. Hi, Kimberly. Okay, and we're here to just discuss the inquiries. A couple years ago, we released a video talking about why inquiry circles would help recovery Dharma. And so far, we've done a ton of inquiry. I thought we would do introductions to qualify ourselves. I'm someone that's worked AA, NA, SAA, ITAA, but I've also done a ton of inquiry. Kimberly?
Oh, and I have worked ACA, Recovery Dharma, and a trauma program known as LIFT, which also had 15 weeks straight of just really intense 5 days a week inquiry, basically.
Yeah, on complex trauma.
Yeah, on complex trauma.
And I've been in Recovery Dharma for a little over 2 years. I went to inpatient treatment for trauma and addictions. I received intense cognitive processing therapy and have been actively engaged in narrative therapy and internal family systems work and EMDR therapy since my discharge 2 years ago.
I respect that. Wow, that's a lot of stuff. Okay. The first question we're asking is, how many months of cumulative inquiry work have you done? And cumulative means multiple inquiry groups stack.
You could say 3 years, but I would say that first year wasn't consistent work.
Yeah.
I managed to find a group of wise friends and I began my inquiry journey, which now includes about 34 months of between 3 groups.
Okay, awesome. I've done something like 12 inquiry circles, each one on average 8 months. So that's like 8 years. So between us, that's like over a decade of inquiry work. Okay, cool. In what ways are the original inquiries the most helpful to you?
For me, what was helpful was looking at Buddhism through the lens of recovery. In some ways, the inquiries in the book are more gentle than traditional Buddhist dialogues I've seen.
Yeah, you've been a Buddhist for a long time.
Yeah.
For me, the original inquiry questions were a good starting point. And so it wasn't until I had some more stability in my neurochemical recovery, so my distance from substance use was far enough that I was able to regulate a little more easily. Even despite trauma, I found that the original questions helped me to kind of identify where I didn't want to go in inquiry and what things were too difficult too soon. I very quickly stepped back from trying to proceed linearly through the Noble Truths. But yeah, so the original inquiry was a good kind of barometer for me to see where I was at. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Kit. For me, it was the inquiries were pretty much like step work. I think of step work as the same process as 2,500-year-old inquiries, but using karma, law of cause and effect through action, like allows us to sort of not look at the symptoms, but really, instead of just putting a Band-Aid on what was bleeding, we get to the root cause of why we bled in the first place so that we can stop it there. Yeah, so the next question, are there any parts of the inquiries that you found repeatedly difficult?
For me, in general, in Buddhist-inspired inquiries, I find just a general lack of trauma-informed line of questioning. So for me, when I am looking at my recovery, I have to look at it through the lens of trauma because trauma is the root cause. So I would say it wasn't that it was difficult, but it was just that I could feel for myself personally, oh, there's this piece missing. And that's a piece that for me had been missing in any Buddhist studies I had done even prior to that.
For me, the most difficult part of inquiry has often been wise intention and looking into amends. When looking at the inquiry questions and thinking about how did I cause harm, who do I owe amends to, what's my fault, I found myself taking on far more fault than I deserved. In my history, there was a lot of manipulation and emotional abuse, and the inquiry process doesn't really hold space for that until you get into wise understanding and wise effort when it talks about balancing compassion for self and others. So the inquiry process can be really challenging if we don't already have a solid foundation of self-compassion and self-care. That was the difficult aspect for me.
I'm totally with you there. Yeah, for me, the wise intention part coming almost halfway through the inquiries. In our book, we go through the heart practices, compassion, appreciation, kindness, equanimity. We don't go through that until halfway through. And I feel like that's imperative before we enter the inquiry process, because there's just some tough stuff going on. What I noticed in the groups that I was part of was every time we got to wise intention, the people that I was working with always felt that this was very difficult to do. Like, I'm not ready to make amends, or it was in wise intention, the longest section of our entire book, that people faced like a burnout. And so we kind of need to do something about this, because after having done many inquiry circles, if everyone's sort of going through this, we kind of have to soften this up, especially if we want to be a truly trauma-informed program. Also, there's what I hear from people, like, if the very first question is list all of the ways that you've harmed others, people said that they would just like stop at that point. And I think it's more beneficial to sort of keep going at a softer, gentler level than to be paralyzed with fear and never return. Thanks, y'all. The next question says, why was it important to you to come up with alternative inquiries or alternative ordering? There are people that say, the book's perfect, don't change it. But I think it's important to build our self-compassion and self-forgiveness and then be able to continue.
That's a really good observation, Tom. I would occasionally consult my first time around when I started in my second and third times around. And the difference in the way I wrote about myself and the way I wrote about the things I was inquiring on, even only spaced 9 months apart, was dramatic. And so the importance of building that foundation of compassion for myself, of being able to set boundaries with the material, was really important. And so I really lean heavily on the parts of the book that describe the inquiry process as being customizable and not set in stone. And so I took that to heart when I started my second round of inquiry after completing it the first time, and looked at a different order. I looked at the inquiry process and tried to figure out what it was I needed to access in order to build my resilience toward dealing with the harder stuff. And beginning my inquiry with wise understanding helped me to start answering that question of, okay, what are the causes and conditions that led me into harmful behavior and maladaptive coping? And building off of that, I was able to begin to find some self-compassion, and building towards amends near the end of my inquiry process helped me a lot in terms of really identifying what truly needed amends, what was a distortion, and why it happened in the first place. And that came from the place of a lot of childhood trauma. I think making the program trauma informed is really important. Trauma affects memory in weird ways, and doing inquiry requires a lot of recollection, which, if is not based on a foundation of trusting myself to tell the right story, it's not helpful. So yeah, looking at new orders and really looking at particularly breaking wise speech up into two separate categories: wise speech about and surrounding myself, and wise speech about and surrounding others. How was I talking negatively, or how was I talking harmfully in my internal world, and how was I speaking harmfully in my external world? Breaking those up and answering them in different times in my inquiry process helped me find more compassion.
Awesome. I love that, Kit. And I especially love your points about really taking to heart the revising, making it your own, because that's really what, Buddhism's been evolving, for a long time, and recovery dharma in itself is an evolution of that. And for me, that evolution really came through when I started doing speaker shares for some recovery Dharma meetings. And a chunk of my share would be about my trauma. And this is how I ended up here. And the people that would come to me after were always people that related to my trauma, not people that related to my addiction. And so then I realized, how do we talk about our trauma, right? And so then for me, there was very much a desire to bring in the line of questioning I had learned from ACA as well as from the trauma program I had gone through, and bring that in and kind of match it up with the recovery Dharma questioning. And the kind of a third piece that came in was this idea of not only focusing on the negative.
Right.
So like, what am I doing right? Or what have I observed in the world that is right? Are there examples I can learn from? And so you might want to share more about that.
Yeah. The direction I thought, Kit, you were going to go with wise speech was I broke it into two sections. How did I speak wisely and how did I listen wisely?
Right. Yeah, because that's what you
So-
did.
I
Yeah.
like that.
I don't think there's a single question in wise speech that goes into listening at all. Did someone listen to us deeply? And I like rephrasing questions in a way where there was someone in our life that listened to us deeply, that was an example for us. I'll go to the actual questions.
And while you're doing that, I just want to comment on what is special to me about doing the inquiries and asking the questions about, like, have you ever observed, seen someone recover, seen someone listen, and things like that. Even if you didn't see it before recovery is usually an opportunity to start seeing those kinds of things. If you're showing up to meetings, if you're working inquiry with people, then you are witnessing people listening. You're witnessing people making healthy choices around how to nurture relationships. And it in itself creates a foundation just by working the inquiries, especially if you do it with others, to be able to say, oh, look, here's an example of some positive traits I've witnessed.
Exactly.
And it was for me in answering that question of, in your childhood, did you have positive examples of people doing this, that, or the other thing, where I was able to really grieve? Because for me, the answer was no
Exactly.
for a long time.
Yeah.
And that gave me a lot of understanding of why I didn't learn these behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
It was a difficult question to answer no to, and I felt some shame about that. And that was something that my inquiry circle was able to hold with me and help me work through. And then I was able to come to the present and see, like Kimberly was saying, in my recovery, I'm seeing that happening and I'm having that behavior modeled for me in a way that I didn't have when I was a child, and I didn't have the ability to learn. And so that's where I started to find some self-compassion around just not knowing what I didn't know.
Right.
And
Exactly.
that was really important for me.
Yeah. So I do want to share on screen wise speech because it didn't occur to me until other people pointed this out. But basically, in the questions of wise speech, the questions are, have you caused harm with your speech? How? Have you been dishonest or harsh in your communication? Do you use speech to hurt or control people, to present a false idea, demand attention, to relieve the discomfort of silence? And then do you say things that are not true, present? And these are all the questions that are written in the book. When I look at this is an inquiry into unwise speech, not an inquiry in wise speech or how I've even listened
Or
wisely.
how to even be wise in your speech.
Right.
There's no exploration of the other side of it, only what have I done wrong, not how can I improve, what can I do.
Inquiry is not a confessional.
Right.
Yeah, building more breadth, more substance to it than just what did you do wrong? Don't do that again.
Yeah.
Right.
We've all heard those messages our entire lives.
Right.
Yeah.
And like in my mind, those things that I've done wrong just play on a tape. And spending time writing them down and sharing them with other people only offers me healing if the receiving end of that communication is listening deeply and can offer me love and compassion in exchange. And that's the point, being able to speak truthfully and receive compassion. That's kind of missing in that bulk of questions as written.
Right.
So I want to go through some of the things, the ways we've reframed this. Where in your life did you notice loving speech and what effect did it have in your life? Like, this is kind of like the unconditional positive regard that therapists, I think, are taught. And by the way, Kimberly has a PhD in psychology, but they're very shy about ever saying that they do, but you're a legit person that knows your stuff. The three of us are some of the main writers that redid these questions. And to be able to ask that very first question alone is that unconditional positive regard. And at the end here, we say, can you give a brief example where deep listening has opened your heart to more compassion? And then do you practice non-judgmental and active listening? Do you use reflection and clarifying questions to ensure that you understand what was spoken?
Yeah, what I love about the listening ones, especially, first of all, that last one, it gives you an opportunity it gives you homework. So when I'm done answering the questions, I'm going to go pay attention to something and try to put this into practice. And even that, for me, plants a seed that everything I answered right before that, even if I say, no, I don't remember having experienced that before, well, now the seed has been planted for me to look for these positive experiences and notice them and pay attention to them and learn from them. So that's what I really like about kind of doing these questions in this way.
Thank you. I'm going to stop the sharing. Hey, welcome back.
Okay.
Okay, so do you feel any of the rewritten inquiries have gained a special benefit, reordering, rephrasing, adding grounding tips?
Yeah, for me, I would say I was a big advocate for adding grounding exercises because, when you're exploring trauma, what I've been taught is, trauma is like taking a soda bottle and shaking it up and then twisting the cap off. When you're exploring trauma, you don't want to twist the cap all the way off all at once because all the stuff comes out and, it's very hard. So grounding exercises are a way to bring yourself back to a place of safety and calm before you continue untwisting the bottle. And actually, some of the kind of positively worded questions can serve that purpose as well. So to me, that was kind of my favorite way of being able to just make it safer, because I did bring a lot of like, all right, let's look at the really ugly stuff from childhood. And but I knew that by doing that, there's a risk, right? And so I think doing that without some grounding effort maybe isn't always the best option for everybody, right? So yeah, that for me was probably my favorite.
Yeah, in the when I started doing inventories, I would spiral out and almost give up. So, yeah.
For me, the most important part of this kind of question, like the thing that I want to share about this question is fine line between talking about trauma and just recounting traumatic events, and being able to create boundaries within the inquiry circle around what we can hold space for and what things we can't was really important. And the nature of the questions in the book sometimes doesn't make room for that. If you're interpreting these questions with the authority of the wisdom that created them, there's a feeling of obligation, perhaps, to stay true to what's written. What I found is that without compassion for myself and compassion for the members of my circle, it could very quickly turn into trauma dumping, which wasn't helpful for anybody.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the rewriting can sometimes create space for talking about positive things, looking for examples of where I didn't learn healthy coping. And so the reordering, the reconsidering of the question's context, the scope of the question, when you look at the first noble truth, how did you cause harm? Do we really need a list of behaviors that tell us that they're suffering, or can we really figure out where we first learned that and find some compassion in our hearts for the small child who learned that suffering existed at the age of 2, when maybe there was an opportunity for nurturing that was missed. So that's where the compassionate approach to inquiry really helped me, is accepting that my childhood was not a happy one. That in the absence of that normative, whatever the hell that means, happy childhood experience, I learned different coping. Having compassion for where I learned that behavior was more important to me than just acknowledging all the ways that it came out sideways later in my life.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you on that. And the trauma dumping part especially is so Research has shown that just talking about trauma doesn't actually benefit, so there's a lot of a need to get into the body or get into the moment and where you were at kind of energetically in that moment and heal that moment. And so like, where did I first learn suffering, I think is a great example of that. It isn't so much exactly what happened in that moment when I first learned suffering. It's about how I felt in that moment and how people responded to me in that moment. And then
what unmet needs show up in that moment that you can now meet.
Exactly. So I think that really comes through with the other ways the questions have been written. And then grounding exercises also kind of add to that sense of giving yourself a little bit of protective shield when you're getting into the tough stuff. And also reminding, for me, when I ground, it reminds me to kind of come back to center so that I can stay within the intention of the inquiries of not trauma dumping, but actually looking at the cause of suffering, the pain itself, and being able to hold that with a little bit more equanimity than I probably could otherwise.
Yeah. Thank you. We just have one final question that we listed here. Is there anything else you'd like to share with the RD community?
I'll say that, I love the direction that the book allows members encouragement to make recovery your own. And that's a large part of Buddhism at its core. And so if my path looks a little bit different from your path or a little bit different from your path, that's okay. And I think that to me is probably the most important message to get out of this. I think it's beneficial when we look at these and we tweak these and we think about what are different ways we can ask. I've gone through the original questions multiple times. I've gone through the inner child version multiple times. I'm going through other random questions. There's no wrong path forward if you're really just looking at it with a lot of intention around healing and growing.
I think what I'd like to add in my final thought is that it's okay to go slow and it's okay to skip parts.
Yes.
It's a wheel. It's going to come back around again.
Yeah.
If you miss wise speech the first time around, get it the next time around. If you're not ready, when you get to wise intention, what does it say in the book? We can set the intention to want to be ready. The recovery is ongoing. And if you start and it's too difficult, try again later.
Mm-hmm.
If you get 3/4 of the way through and your life blows up and you have to stop, come back to it later.
Yeah.
There's no rush. There's no completeness to it. Yeah, take it like a wheel. It's going to roll back around.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's really all healing.
Mm-hmm.
Just summing up both of what each of you said is, there's a quote in the Recovery Dharma book. It talks about the inquiries being a launching point for our healing. What I try to recommend to people and what I've seen in my inquiry circles is that sometimes it doesn't even matter what question we answer. It's about being in community and building that support and learning how to be with people in a way that we can be healing. But the main thing is about whether you do the inner child inquiries or the Eugene reordered questions or the questions out of the book, if it doesn't help your healing and it really causes you to struggle, make the question your own. Turn it into a different question that allows you to talk about the healing that you need or what your needs are and what will benefit your recovery in the end. Making sure that this is tailored for you, which is all the Recovery Dharma program is about, this peer-led movement, this grassroots movement of us being the ones that are empowered. We're not powerless. And this whole recording is just so that we hope people find more freedom in their recovery, wherever you're at on your journey. And thank you so much for sharing your time and your wisdom, Kit and Kimberly.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sending you all love.
Mm.